The scorching Arizona sun beat down mercilessly on the dusty trail that wound through the rocky canyon like a serpent seeking shade. Samuel Mitchell wiped the sweat from his weathered brow as he urged his horse forward, the leather reins slick in his calloused hands. The year was 1882, and the frontier was still a place where a man's character was tested daily by the unforgiving wilderness and the complex relationships between settlers, soldiers, and the Apache people who had called this land home for generations. Samuel was not like the other men who had come west seeking gold or glory. A former schoolteacher from Massachusetts, he had arrived in the Arizona Territory 3 months earlier with a different purpose entirely. His worn saddlebags contained not weapons or mining equipment, but books, writing materials, and medical supplies. He had come to establish a school and clinic in the remote settlement of Copper Creek, driven by a belief that education and understanding could bridge the gaps between cultures that violence had only widened. The settlement itself was barely more than a collection of adobe buildings and wooden structures that seemed to huddle together against the vastness of the desert landscape. Most of the residents were miners, ranchers, and their families, along with a small contingent of soldiers from nearby Fort Apache. The relationship between the settlers and the local Apache bands was tense, marked by years of misunderstanding, broken treaties, and sporadic violence that had left deep scars on both communities. As Samuel approached the outskirts of Copper Creek, he noticed smoke rising from beyond a cluster of mesquite trees. It was not the controlled smoke of a cooking fire or a forge, but the thick, black smoke that spoke of destruction. He spurred his horse into a gallop, his heart racing as he considered the possibilities. Raids were not uncommon in these parts, and the sight of smoke often meant tragedy for someone. When he rounded the bend, Samuel saw the source of the smoke. A small Apache camp, consisting of 3 traditional wickiups and a few temporary shelters, had been attacked. The structures were burning, sending acrid smoke into the crystal-clear desert air. But what caught Samuel's attention was not the destruction itself, but the figures moving among the ruins. A group of soldiers in dusty blue uniforms were systematically searching through the remains of the camp. Their leader, a tall man with sergeant stripes on his sleeves, was shouting orders to his men. Samuel recognized him as Sergeant Marcus Webb, a career soldier who had spent the better part of a decade fighting Apache warriors and had developed a reputation for being particularly harsh in his treatment of captured natives. Samuel dismounted and approached the scene, his footsteps crunching on the dry earth. As he drew closer, he could see that this had not been a battle. There were no signs of armed resistance, no weapons scattered about, no indication that the Apache residents had fought back. This looked more like the aftermath of a raid on defenseless people. "Sergeant Webb!" Samuel called out, his voice carrying across the small clearing. "What happened here?" Webb turned, his weathered face showing irritation at the interruption. He was a man in his 40s, with graying hair and eyes that had seen too much violence. His uniform was dusty from the morning's work, and there was something in his expression that Samuel found deeply troubling. "Mitchell," Webb replied, his tone clipped and official. "Nothing that concerns you, just cleaning up some trouble before it could spread to the settlement." Samuel looked around the destroyed camp more carefully. Near one of the still smoldering wickiups, he could see personal belongings scattered about. Children's toys made from carved wood and woven grass, cooking pots, blankets, and other items that spoke of a family trying to live quietly in the harsh desert environment. This was not the camp of warriors preparing for battle, but of families trying to survive. "Where are the people who lived here?" Samuel asked, though he feared he already knew the answer. Webb's expression hardened. "The men were taken to the fort for questioning, standard procedure when we find unauthorized camps this close to the settlement. And the women and children." There was a long pause before Webb answered. "Also at the fort." Samuel felt a chill despite the desert heat. He knew what conditions were like at Fort Apache for Apache prisoners. The military jail was overcrowded, unsanitary, and entirely unsuitable for families with young children. Moreover, He had heard rumors about how some soldiers treated Apache women, particularly those who had no male relatives to protect them. "Sergeant, these people don't appear to have been causing any trouble. This camp is miles from any settler property, and I can see that they were trying to live peacefully." Webb stepped closer to Samuel, and there was something threatening in his posture. "You've been here 3 months, schoolteacher. I've been fighting Apache for 10 years. Don't presume to tell me how to handle security matters in my territory." Samuel held his ground, though every instinct told him to be careful. Webb was known for his quick temper and his willingness to use violence to solve problems. But Samuel had not come west to avoid difficult situations. "I'm not questioning your authority, Sergeant. I'm simply concerned about the welfare of innocent people, particularly children." "Innocent?" Webb laughed, but there was no humor in the sound. "There are no innocent Apache, Mitchell. Every one of them is a potential threat to the good people of this territory. The children grow up to be warriors, and the women birth more warriors. The only way to have peace is to make sure they understand their place." Samuel felt his jaw tighten at the sergeant's words, but he forced himself to remain calm. He had learned during his short time in the territory that confronting prejudice directly often only made it stronger. Instead, he decided to focus on practical concerns. What will happen to them at the fort? That depends on what the colonel decides. The men will probably be sent to the reservation. The women and children, Webb shrugged, they'll be provided for appropriately. The vague answer sent another chill through Samuel. He had heard stories about what appropriate provision sometimes meant for Apache women in military custody. Some were indeed sent to reservations, but others simply disappeared, sold to brothels in distant towns or worse. Samuel was about to press the issue further when he heard a sound that made his blood run cold. From somewhere behind the largest of the burned wickiups came the faint but unmistakable cry of an infant. Both men froze, listening intently. The cry came again, weak but persistent, clearly from a very young child. "Damn," Webb muttered under his breath. "Thought we got them all." Without waiting for permission, Samuel strode toward the sound. Behind the remnants of what had once been a family dwelling, partially hidden by a fallen support beam and a pile of burned belongings, he found her. She was young, probably no more than 20, with the distinctive features of the Apache people. High cheekbones, dark eyes, and straight black hair that fell to her shoulders. She was clutching an infant to her chest, and both mother and child were covered in soot and dust from the destruction around them. Her traditional Apache dress was torn, and there was a cut on her forehead that had bled and dried, leaving a dark streak down her face. When she saw Samuel approach, her eyes filled with terror. She had clearly been hiding, hoping to avoid capture, but the needs of her crying baby had given away their position. She looked past Samuel to Sergeant Webb, who was now walking toward them with a grim expression on his face. Samuel knelt down slowly, keeping his movements gentle and non-threatening. He had learned a few words of Apache during his time in the territory, though his pronunciation was far from perfect. "I will not hurt you," he said in his halting Apache, then repeated the phrase in English. The woman's eyes darted between Samuel and the approaching sergeant. She seemed to be making some kind of desperate calculation, weighing her options in a situation where she had very few. Webb reached them and looked down at the woman with disgust. Well, looks like we missed one." The infant's cries grew stronger, and the young mother looked up at the two men with an expression of such desperate determination that Samuel felt his heart break. She was clearly prepared to do anything to protect her child. Slowly, she shifted the baby to one arm and used her free hand to reach into a small leather pouch at her side. From it, she pulled out what appeared to be the last of her food, a few pieces of dried meat and some kind of ground corn cake. She held the meager rations out toward Webb, her voice barely above a whisper as she spoke in Apache. Samuel could not understand all the words, but her meaning was clear. She was offering everything she had. When Webb showed no interest in the food, the woman's desperation became even more apparent. She looked up at both men, her dark eyes filled with the kind of fear that only a mother protecting her child could know. Then, in broken English, She spoke words that would haunt Samuel for the rest of his life. "Please," she said, her voice cracking with emotion. "You can use me. Do what you want with me. Just feed my baby. Please, just feed my baby." The words hung in the desert air like a curse. Here was a young mother, faced with the destruction of everything she had known, offering herself in the most degrading way imaginable for the simple hope that her child might survive. Webb's reaction was exactly what Samuel had feared. The sergeant's eyes took on a predatory gleam, and he stepped closer to the kneeling woman. "Well now," Webb said slowly, "that's not an entirely unreasonable proposition." Samuel felt something inside him snap. All his life, he had tried to be a reasonable man, to solve problems through discussion and understanding, but there were some moments when reason was not enough, when a man had to choose between his own safety and doing what was right. "No," Samuel said firmly, stepping between Webb and the woman. Webb's head snapped toward Samuel, his eyes dangerous. "Excuse me? I said no, Sergeant. This woman and her child are under my protection." Webb laughed, but it was not a pleasant sound. "Your protection? Schoolteacher, you have no authority here. This is a military matter." Samuel reached into his jacket and pulled out a folded document. It was his commission from the territorial governor, authorizing him to establish educational and medical facilities in the region. More importantly, it gave him certain civilian authorities that could, in specific circumstances, override military decisions regarding non-combatants. "Actually, Sergeant, I do have authority. This woman is clearly a non-combatant with a dependent child. Under territorial law, I have the right to take custody of civilians who pose no military threat." Webb's face flushed red with anger. "That's ridiculous. She's Apache. She's a mother with a baby," Samuel replied calmly, "and she's now under my protection." The two men faced each other in the desert heat, the tension between them almost palpable. Behind Samuel, the young Apache woman watched this confrontation with wide eyes, clearly not understanding all the English, but recognizing that her fate was being decided. Webb's hand moved toward the pistol at his side, and for a moment, Samuel thought the situation might turn violent. But then, the sergeant seemed to remember that killing a territorial appointee over an Apache woman would create complications that even he might not be able to handle. "You're making a mistake, Mitchell," Webb said finally. "A big mistake. That woman is property of the United States Army, taken in a legitimate military action." "She's a human being," Samuel replied, "and I'm taking responsibility for her." Webb stared at Samuel for a long moment, then spat in the dust at his feet. "Fine, but when she kills you in your sleep, or when her warrior husband comes looking for her, don't come crying to the army for help." With that, Webb turned and stalked away, shouting orders to his men to finish their work and prepare to return to the fort. Samuel watched them go, knowing that he had just made a very dangerous enemy. When the soldiers were gone, Samuel turned back to the young woman. She was still kneeling in the dust, holding her baby close, but now she was looking at him with a mixture of confusion and cautious hope. Samuel knelt down beside her again, this time pulling out his water canteen and offering it to her. She hesitated for a moment, then accepted it gratefully, drinking deeply before using some of the precious water to moisten her baby's lips. "What is your name?" Samuel asked in his halting Apache. The woman looked at him for a long moment before answering. "Ayana," she said softly. Then, pointing to her baby, she added, "This is Kaya." Samuel nodded. "I am Samuel. You and Kaya are safe now." But even as he said the words, Samuel knew they were not entirely true. He had just defied the military authority in a lawless territory, taken responsibility for an Apache woman and her child, and made an enemy of a dangerous man. Safety was a relative term in the Arizona Territory of 1882. Looking around at the destroyed camp, Samuel tried to piece together what had happened here. The attack had been sudden and overwhelming, giving the residents no time to escape or defend themselves. Most had been captured and taken to the fort, but somehow Ayana and her baby had managed to hide. As Samuel helped Ayana to her feet, he noticed something that made his blood run cold. Among the scattered belongings around the destroyed camp, he could see clear evidence that this had been a peaceful settlement. There were farming tools, indicating that the Apache residents had been trying to grow crops. There were children's toys and school materials, suggesting that they had been trying to educate their young ones. Most significantly, there was a small wooden cross among the belongings, indicating that at least some of the residents had been Christians. This had not been a military camp or a staging area for raids. This had been a community of Apache families trying to live peacefully, possibly even trying to assimilate into the broader territorial society. And it had been destroyed, not because it posed a threat, but because its very existence challenged the narrative that all Apache were violent savages who needed to be controlled or eliminated. Samuel looked at Ayanna, who was gently rocking her baby and speaking to the child in soft Apache words. She could not have been much older than his own sister back in Massachusetts, and her child was clearly only a few months old. What kind of life awaited them in this harsh territory, where their very existence was seen as a threat by men like Sergeant Webb? As they walked away from the destroyed camp toward Samuel's horse, Ayanna spoke again in her broken English. "Why you help me?" she asked. "White men no help Apache women." Samuel considered the question carefully. Why had he helped her? It would have been easier and safer to walk away, to let Webb do what he wanted. But something about the moment, when she had offered herself to protect her child, had crystallized everything Samuel believed about human dignity and the responsibility of those with power to protect those without it. "Because it was the right thing to do," he said simply. Ayanna studied his face for a long moment, as if trying to determine whether she could trust this strange white man who spoke Apache and carried books instead of guns. "Where we go now?" she asked. Samuel looked toward the settlement of Copper Creek, visible in the distance as a small cluster of buildings against the vast desert landscape. He knew that bringing an Apache woman and her child into the settlement would create problems. Many of the residents had lost friends or family members in conflicts with Apache bands, and their reception of Ayanna would likely be hostile at best. But he also knew that he could not simply abandon her in the desert. She had no food, no shelter, and no way to care for her child. Moreover, Samuel was beginning to realize that Ayanna might possess knowledge that could be crucial to preventing future tragedies, like the one that had just occurred. "We're going to town," Samuel said. "You and Kaya are going to stay with me until we can figure out something more permanent." As they mounted Samuel's horse, with Ayanna holding her baby in front of her and Samuel behind, he could not help but think about the chain of events that had led to this moment. 3 months ago, he had been a comfortable schoolteacher in Massachusetts, concerned with lesson plans and grammar exercises. Now he was riding through the Arizona desert with an Apache woman and her child, having defied military authority and potentially put his own life at risk. The settlement of Copper Creek was still several miles away, and as they rode, Samuel found himself thinking about the challenges that lay ahead. He would need to find a way to provide for Ayanna and her baby, to protect them from men like Sergeant Webb, and to help them build some kind of life in a territory where their very presence was considered a threat. But more than that, Samuel was beginning to understand that what had happened at the Apache camp was part of a larger pattern of injustice that was playing out across the American West. The destruction of peaceful communities, the separation of families, the reduction of human beings to their racial or cultural identity rather than their individual character. These were not just isolated incidents, but symptoms of a system that dehumanized entire peoples in the name of progress and civilization. As the sun began to set behind the distant mountains, casting long shadows across the desert floor, Samuel made a decision that would change the course of his life. He would not simply provide temporary shelter for Ayanna and her child. He would work to understand what had really happened to her community, to document the truth about the conflicts between settlers and Apache, and to find ways to build bridges between the two cultures. It was an ambitious goal for a schoolteacher from Massachusetts, and Samuel knew that the path ahead would be filled with danger and difficulty. Men like Sergeant Webb would not simply forget about what had happened today, and there would be consequences for defying military authority in such a public way. But as he felt Ayana's weight against his back and heard the soft sounds of baby Kaya, Samuel knew that he had crossed a line from which there could be no return. He had chosen to see Ayana not as an Apache, not as an enemy or a threat, but as a human being in need of help. And that choice would define everything that came after. The lights of Copper Creek were beginning to appear in the distance as full darkness settled over the desert. Samuel urged his horse forward, knowing that the most difficult part of this journey was just beginning. Behind them, smoke was still rising from the destroyed Apache camp, a dark column against the star-filled sky that served as a reminder of how quickly violence could shatter lives and communities. As they approached the outskirts of the settlement, Samuel could see people moving between the buildings, going about their evening routines. Soon, these people would learn that their schoolteacher had arrived with an Apache woman and her child. Some would be angry, some would be afraid, and some might even be dangerous. But Samuel had made his choice, and there was no going back now. Whatever consequences awaited them in Copper Creek, he would face them with Ayana and her child at his side. The Apache woman had knelt in the dust and offered everything she had to protect her baby, but Samuel had chosen another way. Now he would have to live with the results of that choice, for better or worse. The desert wind picked up as they rode into town, carrying with it the scents of sage and dust, and the promise of a future that none of them could predict. Behind them, the destroyed camp continued to smolder, but ahead lay the uncertain path of trying to build something better from the ashes of misunderstanding and hatred. As they drew closer to the settlement, Samuel could see the familiar outline of the buildings that had become his temporary home. There was Murphy's General Store, with its wide front porch where the local men gathered each evening to discuss the day's events and share rumors from other parts of the territory. Next to it stood the Silver Dollar Saloon, where miners and cowboys spent their hard-earned money on whiskey and poker games that often lasted until dawn. The church, a simple wooden structure with a modest bell tower, sat at the far end of the main street. Reverend Thomas Harrison had built it with his own hands when he arrived 2 years earlier, driven by a mission to bring Christianity to what he considered the godless frontier. Samuel had attended services there occasionally, though he found the Reverend's sermons about the inherent evil of the Apache people difficult to reconcile with his own beliefs about human nature. Dr. Catherine Walsh's medical clinic occupied a small adobe building near the center of town. She was one of the few women who had ventured into the territory on her own, having lost her husband to cholera in Kansas, and decided to continue west rather than return to her family in St. Louis. Samuel had worked closely with her during his first months in Copper Creek, and he knew that she shared many of his progressive views about treating all people with dignity and respect. The schoolhouse that Samuel had established was located on the outskirts of town, in a converted warehouse that had previously been used to store mining equipment. It was not much to look at from the outside, but Samuel had worked tirelessly to transform the interior into a proper learning environment. He had painted the walls, built desks and benches from scrap lumber, and filled shelves with books he had brought from Massachusetts or ordered through Murphy's store. Samuel's own living quarters were attached to the schoolhouse, consisting of 2 small rooms that served as his bedroom and office. It was modest accommodation, but it had seemed adequate for a single man trying to make a difference in a frontier community. Now, as he approached with Ayana and her baby, Samuel realized that his living situation was about to become considerably more complicated. As they rode down the main street, Samuel noticed that several people had come out of their buildings to watch their approach. Word traveled fast in a small settlement, and the sight of the town's schoolteacher riding with an Apache woman was certain to generate intense interest and speculation. Standing in front of Murphy's general store was a group of men that Samuel recognized as some of the more influential residents of Copper Creek. There was Murphy himself, a stout Irish immigrant who had parlayed his general store into significant influence over the settlement's commercial activities. Beside him stood Jake Morrison, the foreman of the largest local mine, and Pete Rodriguez, a Mexican-American rancher who had managed to maintain his property despite the prejudices of some of his Anglo neighbors. Samuel could see the expressions on their faces, even from a distance. Murphy looked shocked and concerned. Morrison appeared angry, his jaw set in a hard line that Samuel had learned to associate with trouble. Rodriguez looked curious but wary, clearly trying to assess the implications of what he was seeing. As Samuel's horse came to a stop in front of the general store, the group of men approached slowly. Samuel dismounted carefully, then helped Ayanna down, while she continued to hold her baby protectively against her chest. "Samuel," Murphy said, his Irish accent thick with concern, "what in the name of all that's holy is going on here?" Before Samuel could answer, Morrison stepped forward aggressively. He was a large man, made larger by years of physical labor in the mines, and his presence was intimidating even when he was not angry. "Mitchell, have you lost your damn mind?" Morrison demanded. "You can't bring an Apache into our town. Do you have any idea what kind of danger you're putting us all in?" Samuel held up his hand for calm, though he could feel the tension in the group rising rapidly. "Gentlemen, please listen to me. This woman and her child are not a threat to anyone. They're refugees from an attack on their camp, and they need our help." "Refugees?" Morrison laughed harshly. "They're Apache, Mitchell. They don't become refugees. They make refugees out of decent white folks." Ayanna, who had been listening to this exchange with growing alarm, stepped closer to Samuel. She could not understand all the English being spoken, but the hostile tone was unmistakable. Baby Kaya, sensing her mother's distress, began to cry softly. The sound of the infant's distress seemed to affect the group differently. Murphy's expression softened slightly, while Rodriguez looked genuinely concerned. Morrison, however, became even more agitated. "You see," Morrison said, pointing at the crying baby, "it's already causing problems. We can't have Apache in our town, Mitchell. It's not safe, and it's not right." Samuel felt his own anger beginning to rise, but he forced himself to remain calm. Getting into a shouting match would not help Ayanna or her child, and it might make the situation significantly worse. "Jake, I understand your concerns," Samuel said carefully, "but I want you to look at this woman and her baby. Really look at them. Do they look like a threat to you?" Morrison's eyes flicked toward Ayanna, taking in her torn dress, the cut on her forehead, and the way she held her crying child. For a moment, his expression seemed to waver, but then his face hardened again. "Appearances can be deceiving," Morrison said. "My brother was killed by Apache warriors who looked just as peaceful right up until they put an arrow through his chest." The reference to Morrison's brother brought a moment of uncomfortable silence to the group. Samuel knew that Jake Morrison had come to the territory 5 years earlier with his younger brother, planning to make their fortune in the copper mines. The brother had been killed in a raid on a mining camp 2 years ago, and Morrison had never gotten over the loss. "Jake, I'm sorry about your brother," Samuel said sincerely, "but this woman had nothing to do with that. She's a victim, just like your brother was." "She's Apache," Morrison replied flatly. "That's all I need to know." Samuel was about to respond when another voice joined the conversation. Dr. Catherine Walsh had emerged from her clinic and was walking toward the group. She was a woman in her 30s with prematurely grey hair and intelligent eyes that missed very little of what went on in the settlement. "What's all the commotion about?" Dr. Walsh asked as she approached. Samuel turned toward her with relief. If anyone in Copper Creek might be sympathetic to Ayanna's situation, it would be Dr. Walsh. "Catherine, this is Ayanna and her baby, Kaya. Their camp was attacked this morning and they need medical attention and shelter." Dr. Walsh looked at Ayanna with professional interest, immediately noticing the cut on her forehead and the signs of exhaustion and distress. Her medical training had taught her to see patients as human beings first, regardless of their race or background. "She's injured," Dr. Walsh observed, stepping closer to examine Ayana's forehead. "And the baby looks undernourished. When did they last eat?" "I don't know," Samuel admitted, "but they've been hiding in the desert since the attack this morning." Dr. Walsh nodded and spoke directly to Ayana, using simple English words and gentle gestures to communicate. "You hurt? Baby sick?" Ayana looked uncertainly between Dr. Walsh and Samuel, clearly trying to decide whether she could trust this new person. Finally, she nodded and spoke in her broken English. "Baby hungry. Very hungry. I have no food." The simple statement seemed to cut through some of the tension in the group. Even Morrison looked uncomfortable as he watched the young mother's obvious distress about her child's welfare. "Doctor," Walsh turned to face the group of men with a determined expression. "Regardless of the political implications, I have a medical responsibility here. This woman and her child need immediate attention." "Catherine," Murphy said carefully, "you know I respect your medical judgment, but Jake has a point about the safety concerns." "What safety concerns?" Dr. Walsh asked sharply. "A malnourished woman with an infant, even if she wanted to cause trouble, which seems highly unlikely. What exactly do you think she could do?" Morrison started to respond, but Dr. Walsh cut him off with a gesture. "Jake, I know you've suffered losses, and I'm not minimizing your pain, but look at this situation objectively. This woman is exhausted, injured, and desperate to feed her child. She's not a warrior planning an attack. She's a mother in crisis." Samuel watched this exchange with growing hope. Dr. Walsh's clinical perspective was helping to focus the discussion on practical rather than emotional concerns. Rodriguez, who had been quietly observing the interaction, finally spoke up. "What exactly are you proposing, Samuel? We can't just ignore the fact that harboring Apache could bring trouble from the military or from other Apache bands looking for their people." It was a reasonable question, and Samuel was grateful that Rodriguez had raised it in a non-hostile manner. "I'm not asking anyone else to take responsibility," Samuel said. "Ayana and her baby will stay with me at the schoolhouse. I'll provide for their needs and ensure that they don't cause any problems for the rest of the community." "And what happens when Sergeant Webb finds out?" Morrison asked. "You think he's just going to forget that you interfered with a military operation?" Samuel felt a chill at the mention of Webb's name. He had been so focused on getting Ayana to safety that he had not fully considered the long-term implications of his confrontation with the sergeant. "I'll deal with Sergeant Webb when the time comes," Samuel said, though he was not entirely sure how. Murphy shook his head slowly. "Samuel, lad, you don't understand what you're getting yourself into. Webb's not the kind of man who forgets or forgives. He's going to see this as a personal challenge to his authority." "Then what would you have me do?" Samuel asked, his frustration beginning to show. "Leave this woman and her baby to die in the desert? Let Webb do whatever he wanted with them?" The question hung in the air, and Samuel could see that some of the men were struggling with the moral implications of the situation. It was one thing to oppose helping Apache in abstract terms, but quite another to actively advocate for abandoning a mother and child. Dr. Walsh broke the uncomfortable silence. "Whatever the political ramifications, the immediate medical needs are clear. I'm going to examine this woman and her child and provide whatever treatment they require." She turned to Ayana and spoke in her simple, clear English. "Come, I help you and baby." Ayana looked at Samuel for confirmation, and he nodded encouragingly. She followed Dr. Walsh toward the clinic, walking slowly and carefully as she held baby Kaya. As the two women walked away, the group of men continued their discussion in lower tones. "Samuel," Murphy said quietly, "I can see that your heart's in the right place, but you need to think about the consequences. If the Apache bands think we're holding one of their women prisoner, they might attack the settlement. And if the military thinks we're harboring fugitives," Rodriguez added, "they might decide that Copper Creek is no longer loyal to the territorial government." Samuel could see the genuine concern in both men's faces. They were not motivated by simple prejudice, but by legitimate fears about the safety and security of their community. "I understand your concerns," Samuel said, "but I believe there's another way to look at this situation. What if, instead of seeing Ayana as a threat, we see her as an opportunity?" Morrison frowned. "What kind of opportunity?" "An opportunity to build understanding between our communities," Samuel explained. "Ayana can help us understand Apache culture and concerns, and we can demonstrate that not all white settlers are hostile to peaceful coexistence." "That's a nice theory," Morrison said skeptically, "but theories don't stop arrows or bullets." Samuel was about to respond when he noticed a commotion at the far end of the street. A group of riders was approaching at a fast pace, and even from a distance, Samuel could see the dust cloud they were raising. "Who's that?" Rodriguez asked, shading his eyes against the setting sun. As the riders drew closer, Samuel's heart sank. Leading the group was Sergeant Webb, and he was accompanied by half a dozen soldiers. They were riding hard and looked angry. "Trouble," Murphy muttered. "Big trouble." The soldiers reached the main street and came to a halt in front of the general store. Webb dismounted and strode toward the group of men with the aggressive confidence of someone accustomed to having his orders followed without question. "Where is she?" Webb demanded without preamble. Samuel stepped forward, trying to project more confidence than he felt. "Sergeant Webb, as I explained to you earlier, the woman and her child are under my protection." Webb's face flushed red with anger. "Your protection? Mitchell, you have no idea what you've done. That woman is wanted for questioning in connection with raids on settler properties." "What raids?" Samuel asked, genuinely surprised. "The camp we found had been attacked, not the other way around. The camp was being used as a staging area for war parties," Webb replied. "We have reliable intelligence that warriors from that group were involved in attacks on ranches and mining operations throughout the region." Samuel felt a moment of doubt. What if he had misread the situation? What if Ayana was not the innocent victim he had believed her to be? But then he remembered the scene at the destroyed camp, the children's toys, the farming tools, the evidence of families trying to live peacefully. Whatever intelligence Webb claimed to have, it did not match what Samuel had observed with his own eyes. "Sergeant, I saw that camp. There was no evidence of military activity. It was a family settlement, not a war camp." Webb stepped closer to Samuel, and his voice dropped to a dangerous whisper. "Are you calling me a liar, schoolteacher?" The confrontation was interrupted by the emergence of Dr. Walsh from her clinic. She walked toward the group with a determined stride, clearly having something important to say. "Sergeant Webb," she said formally, "I've just completed a medical examination of the Apache woman and her child." Webb turned toward her with an expression of irritation. "Dr. Walsh, that woman is military property. She should not have been examined without proper authorization." "She's a human being in medical distress," Dr. Walsh replied firmly. "And I have news that I think will interest everyone here." She paused for dramatic effect, looking around the circle of men who were watching her intently. "The woman has been severely beaten, probably within the last few days. She has bruises on her arms and back that are consistent with being struck with rifle butts or similar weapons. Moreover, she's suffering from malnutrition, indicating that she and her child have been without adequate food for an extended period." Webb's expression did not change, but Samuel noticed that some of the other soldiers looked uncomfortable. "That doesn't prove anything," Webb said. "Apache women are often mistreated by their own men." Dr. Walsh shook her head. "These injuries are not consistent with domestic violence, Sergeant. They're consistent with military interrogation techniques." The implication of her words was clear, and several of the townsmen looked shocked. Samuel felt his anger rising as he realized what Dr. Walsh was suggesting. "Are you saying that this woman was tortured?" Samuel asked. "I'm saying that she has injuries consistent with physical coercion," Dr. Walsh replied carefully. "And given that she and her child were found hiding after a military raid on their camp, I think the source of those injuries is fairly obvious." Webb's face had gone from red to purple with rage. "Dr. Walsh, you are making serious accusations without any evidence." I have medical evidence, Dr. Walsh replied calmly, and I'm prepared to document it officially if necessary. The standoff between Webb and Dr. Walsh was tense and dangerous. Samuel could see that the sergeant was struggling to control his temper, and he feared that the situation might escalate to violence. But then Rodriguez stepped forward, his calm voice cutting through the tension. "Sergeant Webb, perhaps we could discuss this situation more calmly. No one here wants trouble with the military, but we also can't ignore evidence of mistreatment of civilians." Webb looked around the group, clearly assessing his options. He was outnumbered, and several of the townsmen were looking at him with expressions of distrust and disapproval. "Fine," Webb said finally, "but this isn't over. That woman is wanted for questioning, and I will have her back in military custody." He remounted his horse and looked down at Samuel with undisguised hatred. "Mitchell, you think you're some kind of hero, but you have no idea what forces you're playing with. The Apache are not noble savages waiting to be civilized. They're killers, and that woman you're protecting has blood on her hands." With that, Webb spurred his horse and rode out of town with his soldiers, leaving behind a cloud of dust and an atmosphere of unresolved tension. As the sound of hoofbeats faded in the distance, the group of townsmen stood in uncomfortable silence. Finally, Murphy spoke up. "Well, that settles it. We're all in this together now, whether we like it or not." Samuel looked around at the faces of his neighbors, trying to gauge their reactions to what had just occurred. Some looked worried, others angry, but none looked ready to abandon Ayana to Webb's tender mercies. "What do we do now?" Rodriguez asked. Samuel thought for a moment before answering. "We do what's right. We protect a mother and her child, and we stand up to bullies who abuse their authority." Morrison, who had been silent during the confrontation with Webb, finally spoke up. "This is going to bring trouble down on all of us, Mitchell. You realize that, don't you?" "I realize that," Samuel replied. "But some things are more important than avoiding trouble." As the sun finally set behind the distant mountains, the people of Copper Creek found themselves facing a challenge that would test their character and their commitment to their stated values. The arrival of Ayana and her child had forced them to confront uncomfortable questions about justice, compassion, and the true meaning of civilization in a harsh and unforgiving land. The first chapter of their story together was ending, but the real challenges lay ahead in the dusty streets and suspicious minds of Copper Creek, where the arrival of an Apache woman and her child would test the character of every person in the settlement.